The midday sun beat down heavily on the pavement outside, but inside the air was cool and smelled strongly of roasted garlic and fresh coffee. Maya smoothed the front of her black apron, tying the strings tightly around her waist. It was the same uniform she wore every day, but today it felt a little heavier than usual. She looked around the busy dining room of the Gilded Fork. It was a Tuesday, which meant the lunch rush was in full swing. Businessmen in suits sat in the booths checking their watches, and small groups of friends laughed over salads and sandwiches. To everyone in the room, Maya was invisible. She was just a pair of hands carrying a tray, a voice asking if they wanted more water, or a shadow moving between tables to clear away dirty plates. They didn't see the person underneath the uniform. They didn't know that her hands, which were currently gripping a heavy coffee pot, were capable of creating something beautiful. They just saw the waitress. She moved through the tables with a kind of practiced grace, weaving around chairs and dodging waiters. "Excuse me, coming through," she said softly to a man who was blocking the aisle with his briefcase. He didn't even look up, just moved his leg an inch so she could pass. She was used to it. In this city, if you weren't the one spending the money, you were often treated like the furniture. Maya reached table 12, where a woman was waiting for her check. "Here you go, ma'am," Maya said, placing the small leather folder on the table. Finally, the woman muttered, tapping a manicured nail on the table. She didn't leave a tip. Maya just nodded, picked up the folder, and walked away. She didn't let it bother her. She had a job to do, and she needed every dollar she could get. Her shift lasted for another 4 hours. When it finally ended, the rush had died down, and the restaurant was quiet except for the clinking of silverware as the staff reset the tables for the dinner service. Maya clocked out and walked into the break room to grab her bag. She felt a deep tiredness in her shoulders that had nothing to do with carrying trays. It was the kind of tiredness that comes from hiding a huge part of yourself from the world. She stepped out the back exit and into the alleyway. It was a warm evening, the air thick with the smell of car exhaust and trash. She didn't mind. It meant she was free from the noise of the dining room. She walked the 4 blocks to her apartment building. It was an old brick place with a broken buzzer and peeling paint on the hallway doors. Climbing the 3 flights of stairs was a workout in itself, but she didn't mind the exercise. When she unlocked her apartment door, the familiar smell of home greeted her. It wasn't fancy. It was a small studio with a kitchenette in the corner and a bed that took up most of the floor space. The walls were thin, and she could hear her neighbor watching TV through the vent. But to Maya, it was a sanctuary, because in the corner, standing against the far wall, covered in a thin layer of dust to protect it from the sun, was her upright piano. It wasn't a grand piano like the ones she saw in concert halls on television. It was a battered, second-hand spinet she had bought years ago from a family moving away. Some of the keys were chipped, and it had a slight wobble when she played the low notes too hard, but to her, it was perfect. It was the only thing in the room that truly mattered. Maya dropped her bag on the floor and didn't even bother taking off her shoes or washing her face first. She walked straight to the corner and pulled off the dust cover. The wood was scratched, but the keys looked inviting. She sat down on the bench and took a deep breath. This was the moment she lived for. All day long, she had to smile at people who looked right through her. She had to be polite to people who were rude. But here, in this small room, she didn't have to be anyone. She could just be. She rested her fingers on the keys. They were calloused from work, rough and dry, but they were sensitive. She closed her eyes and listened to the silence of the room. Then, She pressed down. The first chord rang out, filling the small space. It was a sound that felt like a hug. She began to play a piece by Chopin. It was slow and sad, the notes flowing like water. As she played, the tension in her shoulders melted away. The memory of the rude customer at table 12 faded. The smell of the restaurant disappeared. There was only the music. Maya hadn't always been a waitress. 10 years ago, she was a student at a prestigious music academy. Her teachers had told her she had a gift, something rare that couldn't be taught. She spent hours in practice rooms, her fingers flying over the keys, dreaming of the stage. She could play complex sonatas from memory, feeling every emotion the composer had put into the notes. Music was her language, the way she understood the world. But life has a way of changing plans without asking for permission. Her mother got sick. The medical bills piled up higher than the stack of sheet music on her desk. The academy tuition became impossible to pay. Maya had to make a choice. She could stay in school and watch her family drown in debt, or she could drop out and work. She chose her family. She sold a lot of her things to help pay the bills, but she refused to sell the piano. It was the last piece of her old life she had left. She found jobs in restaurants and cafes, working double shifts whenever she could. The long hours and the physical work made it hard to find time to practice, but she did it whenever she could. Sometimes she would come home after a 12-hour shift, exhausted and ready to collapse, but she would still sit down and play for 10 minutes. It was the only way she could feel like herself again. She finished the Chopin piece and let her hands rest in her lap. The room felt peaceful. Outside, a car honked its horn, and a dog barked, but inside, the music still hung in the air. Maya looked at her hands. In the restaurant, they were invisible, just tools for carrying heavy plates. But here, they were magic. They could make people feel things, cry, or remember a lost love. She stood up and walked to the small window, looking out at the city skyline. The lights were coming on, flickering like stars in the distance. She wondered how many other people in those buildings were hiding their true selves, just like she was. How many other artists were working desk jobs, or how many writers were sweeping floors. It was a lonely thought. Maya turned back to the piano. She didn't have much time before she needed to sleep and start the cycle all over again tomorrow. But she wanted to play one more song. This time, she chose something faster, something with more energy. Her fingers found the keys easily, dancing over the ivories. She didn't need to read the music, it was all inside her head, written in her heart. For a few minutes, the small, dusty apartment wasn't an apartment anymore. It was a concert hall. She wasn't a tired waitress in a stained uniform. She was a musician, sharing her soul with the world. And even though the only audience was the cracked wall and the dying plant on the windowsill, it was enough. It had to be enough. She played the final note, letting it fade into silence. She sat there for a long time, just listening to the quiet, until the city noises outside came back to her. Maya carefully lowered the keyboard cover and draped the cloth back over the piano. She patted the wood gently, like a friend, and stood up. It was time to get ready for bed. Tomorrow would bring new customers, new complaints, and more heavy trays. She would put on her apron and her fake smile, and she would do it all again because she had to survive. But she knew that when she walked back through that door, her music would be waiting for her. It was her secret. Her superpower. And as long as she had that, she could handle anything the world threw at her. The atmosphere at the Gilded Fork was different tonight. Usually, By the time the sun went down, the restaurant would be filled with couples on dates or families looking for a good meal. But tonight, it had been booked out entirely for a private corporate event. The floor manager had gathered the staff before the shift to give them a warning. "These people spend a lot of money," he had said, adjusting his tie nervously. "Be invisible, be fast, and don't make small talk unless they start it. This is a big night for us." The change in the room was obvious the moment Chloe walked onto the floor. The lighting had been dimmed to make the place look more expensive, and the regular wooden tables were covered in crisp, white linens that reached all the way to the floor. Centerpieces with tall white candles sat on every table, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. Instead of the usual noise of clinking silverware and laughter, the room was filled with a low hum of serious conversation and the sound of ice cubes swirling in glasses of expensive scotch. Chloe tightened the black bow tie around her neck and took a deep breath. She hated these events. The regulars were much easier to handle, they knew her face, they sometimes joked with her, and they treated her like a person. These corporate events brought in a different crowd. They looked through her as if she were a ghost, or worse, they looked at her like she was a piece of equipment that wasn't working fast enough. She picked up a heavy silver tray loaded with glasses of champagne from the bar. The bartender, a guy named Dave who looked as tired as she felt, gave her a sympathetic nod. "Good luck out there," he muttered. "Table 4 is already complaining about the temperature." Chloe maneuvered her way through the crowd, offering drinks to men in dark suits and women in expensive jewelry. She moved like a shadow, stepping in, placing a napkin down, setting a drink on the coaster, and stepping back out before the person even had to look up. It was a skill she had perfected over years of working in the service industry. The goal was to meet their needs without becoming a part of their conversation. Near the center of the room, a man named Julian was holding court. He was a senior partner at the firm hosting the party, and he was clearly enjoying the attention. He had loosened his tie and was gesturing wildly with a half-full drink in his hand as he told a story to a younger colleague sitting across from him. Chloe moved past them a few times, clearing empty appetizer plates. She tried to stay out of their line of sight, but the restaurant was crowded, and there wasn't much room to hide. As she leaned over to grab a small plate from the young colleague's side, Julian stopped talking mid-sentence. He turned his head and looked directly at her. Up close, his face was red from the alcohol, and his eyes had that sharp, critical look that Chloe dreaded. He didn't look at her with anger, but with a kind of curious amusement, like a child looking at a bug in a jar. "Hold on a second," Julian said, loud enough that a few people at the neighboring tables turned to look. He waved a hand in front of Chloe's face, signaling her to stop. Chloe froze, her hand hovering over the table. She straightened up, keeping her expression neutral. "Yes, sir, is everything all right with the service?" she asked, keeping her voice level and professional. Julian smirked. He leaned back in his chair, draping his arm over the empty chair next to him. He gestured toward the far corner of the room. There, sitting alone in the spotlight, was a beautiful grand piano. It was polished to a shine and reflected the candle light. Usually, it was just for decoration, but tonight, they had hired a professional pianist to provide background music. "I was just explaining to the kid here about culture," Julian said, pointing a thick finger at the young man across from him, who looked down at his plate, clearly embarrassed. "See that piano? That takes discipline. That takes years of dedication. It separates us from the rest." He turned his gaze back to Chloe, looking her up and down, taking in her black uniform and the name tag pinned to her chest. He let out a short, Dismissive laugh. It must be nice, in a way, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You just come in, you carry the food, you go home. You don't have to think. You don't have the pressure of creating something or being someone important. You're just a waitress. The words hung in the air. You're just a waitress. A few people nearby chuckled awkwardly, forcing smiles to be polite to their boss. The young colleague turned even redder. Chloe felt a hot flush rise up her neck. She wanted to snap back. She wanted to tell him that she knew more about discipline than he ever would, that she had spent hours in a practice room while he was out partying. She wanted to tell him that her hands could create music that would make him cry. But the memory of her rent bill, the electric bill sitting unpaid on her counter at home, and the fact that the manager was watching from across the room stopped her. She was just a waitress to him. And if she fought back, she would be the unreasonable staff member, and she could lose the job she desperately needed. So, she swallowed the pride that tasted like bile in her throat. She forced a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Can I get you gentlemen another drink, or perhaps some water?" she asked, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. Julian waved his hand at her, shooing her away like a fly. "No, no. That's all. Run along now." Chloe nodded once, turned on her heel, and walked away toward the kitchen. She kept her head high and her back straight, fighting the urge to run. She could feel the eyes of the table burning into her back. She could hear Julian laughing as he resumed his story, probably making another joke at her expense. She pushed through the swinging doors that led to the kitchen and let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. The noise of the chefs shouting orders and the clanging of pans washed over her, usually a stressful sound, but tonight it felt safer than the silence of the dining room. She walked over to the sink and gripped the edge of the stainless steel counter, squeezing her eyes shut for a second. Her hands were shaking slightly, just a small tremor she couldn't control. It wasn't because she was scared of him. It was because he was so wrong, and it hurt that he could look at a human being and reduce them to a single, useless label. He looked at the piano and saw class. He looked at her and saw service. He didn't know that she was the same person who could play the Moonlight Sonata perfectly in the dark. He didn't know that she could look at a sheet of music and hear the symphony in her head. A dishwasher named Sam walked by with a rack of dirty glasses. He stopped when he saw her face. "You okay, Chloe? You look like you saw a ghost." Chloe opened her eyes and looked at her reflection in the shiny metal refrigerator door. She fixed her hair and took a deep breath, schooling her features back into the mask of the professional server. "I'm fine, Sam," she lied. "Just a long night." She washed her hands quickly with cold water, drying them on a rough towel. She couldn't let Julian get to her. He was just a customer. He was just noise. But as she picked up a fresh tray of appetizers and prepared to head back out into the lion's den, the words echoed in her mind. "You're just a waitress." She wondered, not for the first time, if she would ever be anything else to the world, or if her music was destined to remain a secret forever. She pushed the door open and stepped back into the room, the smile plastered back on her face, ready to be invisible again. The music from the grand piano had been a steady, calming stream of sound all night, acting like a soundtrack to the clinking glasses and low murmurs of the corporate party. The pianist, an older gentleman with thinning gray hair and a sharp suit, sat with perfect posture, his fingers moving lightly over the keys. He was playing soft jazz, the kind of music that was meant to be ignored but would be missed if it stopped. Chloe had been watching him out of the corner of her eye whenever she passed near the corner of the room. It was a bittersweet sight for her. She knew the effort it took to play that smoothly, the muscle memory and the years of practice. Seeing him up there, getting paid to do what he loved or at least what he was good at made her chest ache a little, but she quickly pushed the feeling down every time it surfaced. She was moving through the room with a tray of dirty dishes, heading toward the kitchen doors, when the music abruptly cut off in the middle of a phrase. It wasn't a clean ending. It was a sudden, jarring silence that made a few people near the piano look up in confusion. Chloe stopped walking and looked over. The older gentleman had stood up, but he wasn't bowing. He was clutching his lower back with one hand, his face twisted in a grimace of pain. He swayed slightly, reaching out to stabilize himself on the glossy lid of the piano. Chloe didn't think, she moved. She set her tray down on a nearby side table and rushed over to him. She reached his side just as he looked like he might lose his balance. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked quietly, taking his arm to help steady him. The man looked at her, sweat beading on his forehead. "It's my back," he hissed through gritted teeth. "Old injury. It just locked up. I can't sit down, let alone play." The silence from the piano was beginning to spread through the room. The background noise of the party seemed louder without the music to soften it. People were starting to stare. It didn't take long for the floor manager to notice the commotion. He came bustling over, his face flushed with panic, smoothing his hair back as he walked. "What's going on?" the manager demanded, looking from the pale pianist to Chloe. "Why did the music stop?" "He can't play," Chloe explained, keeping a firm grip on the older man's elbow. "He's in a lot of pain." The manager looked like he might be sick. The corporate clients were particular, they expected everything to be perfect. A broken pianist was not part of the plan. "We have to do something," the manager whispered frantically, looking out at the sea of tables. "We can't just have silence. It's bad for the vibe. They'll complain." He looked at the pianist. "Can you take a break? Some painkillers, come back in 10 minutes. The pianist shook his head slowly, carefully straightening up as the sharp spasm seemed to pass lightly. "I can't bend my spine, my friend. I need to go home and put ice on this. I'm sorry." He began to pack up his sheet music with trembling hands, looking defeated. The manager was wringing his hands together. He looked around the room desperately, as if hoping another musician was hiding behind a potted plant. "I can't call someone else. It's too late. It's a Friday night." Just then, Mr. Jeers, the older pianist, looked up. He met Chloe's eyes. He remembered her from the break room earlier that week. He had seen her sitting on an empty milk crate in the alleyway during her break, holding a small, crumpled piece of paper sheet music she had found in a library book sale. He had heard her humming a complex Bach melody while she polished silverware, matching the pitch perfectly. He had seen the way she looked at the piano not as furniture, but as a living thing. He nudged the manager gently and nodded his head toward Chloe. "The girl," Mr. Jeers said, his voice raspy but audible. "Ask the girl." The manager blinked, looking at Chloe as if he had never seen her before. He frowned. She's a server." "She knows," Mr. Jeers insisted softly. "I've heard her. She has the hands of a player." The manager turned to Chloe, skepticism written all over his face. He looked desperate, though. The room was getting restless. A man at the big table in the center, the one who had made fun of Chloe earlier, was already looking at his watch and frowning. "Chloe," the manager asked, his tone doubtful. "Do you? I mean, can you play anything, just simple stuff, background noise, something to keep them happy?" Chloe felt a sudden drop in her stomach. She looked at the piano. The black and white keys shimmered under the spotlight. She looked at Mr. Jayers, who was giving her a weak, encouraging smile. She thought about the rude man, Julian, and his comment about culture and talent. She thought about her drafty apartment and the dusty upright piano sitting in the corner. She hadn't performed in front of a crowd since she left the academy. That was years ago. Her hands were rough from carrying trays now, not conditioned to the ivory keys of a concert Steinway. But she knew she could do it. The music was the one thing she couldn't forget, no matter how hard she tried to focus on serving food. I can play, Chloe said, her voice barely a whisper. Yes. I can play. The relief on the manager's face was instant. Great. Okay. Just, keep it light. Nothing crazy. And if anyone complains, stop immediately. Mr. Jayers carefully moved away from the bench, wincing as he stepped aside. It's all yours, he said quietly to Chloe. Play something beautiful. Chloe nodded to him. She watched him slowly walk away, aided by another staff member, before she turned back to the instrument. She walked around to the bench. It felt strange to approach it from the front, not as a guest, but as the performer. She could feel dozens of eyes on her as she sat down. The bench was cold and hard. She reached out and adjusted the height slightly, a habit she couldn't break. She placed her hands on the keys. They felt slick and nervous. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. She could hear Julian's voice in her head again, that mocking tone. You're just a waitress. She looked out at the room. Most people had gone back to their conversations, assuming the waitress was just helping the old man pack up. They didn't expect her to actually play. But as she sat there, the silence stretching on, a few heads turned. The man at the center table, Julian, stopped talking and looked over. He raised an eyebrow, a look of amused curiosity on his face. He probably expected her to plunk out chopsticks or a messy nursery rhyme. Chloe closed her eyes for a second. She blocked out the smell of the perfume and the food. She blocked out the clatter of the kitchen. She imagined she was back in her small apartment, safe and alone. She let her fingers find the starting position. She wasn't going to play light jazz. She wasn't going to play background noise. She was going to play something that demanded to be heard. She pressed the first key. It was a deep, resonant note that cut through the ambient noise of the room like a knife. Then, she began. The first note that Chloe played didn't just sound, it seemed to vibrate right through the floorboards and up the legs of the chairs. It was a deep, resonant C-sharp minor, full of sadness and weight. It wasn't the polite, tinkling jazz that the previous pianist had been playing. This was something else entirely. The sound hung in the air, heavy and thick, demanding that everyone pay attention. For the first few seconds, the room didn't react. The men at the tables were still talking loudly, laughing about stock markets and golf scores. The clinking of silverware continued, but as Chloe's right hand gently joined in, playing a slow, mournful melody that seemed to weep over the deep bass notes, a strange thing began to happen. The conversations at the tables closest to the piano started to die down. One by one, people stopped chewing. They stopped mid-sentence. The sound was too beautiful to ignore. It wasn't just noise, it was a story being told without a single word. It was Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, but it wasn't the gentle version people often heard on the radio. Chloe played it with a raw, stripped bare intensity. She played it like she was saying goodbye to something she loved. Chloe kept her eyes fixed on her hands, but her mind was far away from the restaurant. She wasn't thinking about the stained apron she was wearing or the tray of dishes she had to clear. She was back in her small apartment, playing on her old, battered piano. She was letting out all the frustration of the day, the years of hiding her talent, and the ache of being invisible. She hit the keys harder than she meant to a few times, putting her anger into the music, and the piano roared in response, echoing off the high ceiling. At the center table, Julian had just been telling a story about a recent vacation. He was waving his hands, enjoying the sound of his own voice. But as the music grew louder, wrapping around the room like a thick fog, he found himself trailing off. He looked toward the corner of the room, annoyed that the background noise was getting too loud. He expected to see the old man back on the bench, fumbling with the keys. Instead, he saw the waitress. He saw the girl he had sneered at earlier, the girl he had called just a waitress. She was hunched over the keys, her posture completely different from the way she stood when she was serving food. She wasn't trying to be small anymore. She took up space. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm, her fingers moving across the ivory keys with a speed and precision that didn't make sense. Julian frowned. He leaned forward, his drink forgotten on the table. He watched her hands. They weren't the clumsy hands of a part-time amateur. They knew exactly where to go. They jumped from the low end of the keyboard to the high end effortlessly, playing complex chords that Julian knew, even with his limited knowledge of music, were incredibly difficult. A hush was falling over the entire dining room now. It was spreading outward from the piano like a ripple. The waiters stopped in the aisles, holding trays, mesmerized by the sound. The kitchen staff peeked through the small round windows of the swinging doors, listening. Even the manager, who had been frantically counting receipts at the host stand, froze and looked up. Chloe moved into the second part of the piece. The mood shifted from deep sadness to something more agitated, like a storm gathering strength. Her left hand began to move rapidly, playing a rolling triplet rhythm that never stopped, driving the music forward. The sound was urgent and intense. It filled every corner of the gilded fork, drowning out the hum of the refrigerator and the traffic outside. The music demanded respect. It was the sound of discipline, of thousands of hours of practice, of a soul that had been through hard times and came out stronger. It was everything Julian had claimed she wasn't. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, a tightness he couldn't explain. He looked around at his colleagues. The young man he had been lecturing earlier was staring at the piano with his mouth slightly open. The laughter was gone from the room. The arrogance had evaporated. As Chloe played, she felt a change happen inside herself. The fear she had felt earlier, the shame of Julian's words, began to dissolve. She realized that she didn't need their validation. The music was true. It was real. It was the most honest thing in the room. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a servant. She felt like an artist. She approached the final movement of the sonata. This was the hardest part. It was fast, furious, and technically demanding. Her fingers had to fly up and down the keyboard, striking the keys with force and accuracy. She didn't hold back. She let the emotion pour out of her, channeling every rude customer, every unpaid bill, and every lonely night into the keys. The sound was overwhelming, a wave of sound that crashed over the listeners. People actually turned in their chairs to face her now. They weren't looking at their phones or their food. They were captivated. The rich businessmen in their expensive suits looked like little boys listening to a ghost story. The air in the room felt electric, charged with the energy of the performance. Julian sat very still. He saw the look on Chloe's face. It was fierce and concentrated. She wasn't performing for them, she was performing in spite of them. And that made him feel very small. He looked at his own hands, resting on the white tablecloth, and felt a sudden pang of shame. He had judged a book by its cover, and he had been completely wrong. The talent he had claimed she lacked was staring him right in the face, and it was more powerful than he could have imagined. Chloe's hands were a blur now. She was playing at full speed, the notes cascading down like a waterfall. The intensity built and built until it felt like the piano might shake apart. Then, with a sudden, dramatic shift, she slammed into the final chords. 3 heavy, resonant chords that rang out like gunshots in the quiet room. Bum. 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 She held the last chord, letting the sustain pedal keep the sound alive. She didn't lift her hands immediately. She let the vibrations hum through her fingertips. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, stunned silence. No one spoke. No one moved. You could literally hear the air conditioning humming in the vents. It was as if the entire room had been holding its breath for the last 5 minutes and had finally forgotten how to exhale. Chloe slowly lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap. The spell was broken. She looked out at the room, her eyes focusing again on the reality around her. For a second, she felt a wave of panic. She had forgotten where she was. She had forgotten she was working. Then, from the back of the room, a single person started to clap. It was the dishwasher, Sam. Then the bartender joined in. Then, a guest at a table near the window stood up. Within seconds, the applause wasn't just polite clapping, it was a roar. It was a wave of appreciation that washed over the room, louder than the traffic, louder than the earlier conversations. The dining room erupted. Chloe sat there on the bench, her face flushing red. She wasn't used to this. She was used to being ignored, not applauded. She saw Julian out of the corner of her eye. He wasn't clapping. He was just sitting there, staring, his face completely pale, looking like he had just seen a ghost. He wasn't smirking anymore. He looked smaller, quieter. The manager rushed over, beaming, looking like he couldn't believe his luck. But Chloe didn't wait for him. She stood up, smoothing her apron automatically, her hands trembling slightly not from fear now, but from the rush of adrenaline. She took a small, awkward bow, not like a concert pianist, but like a girl who was surprised to be seen. Then, she turned and walked quickly away from the piano, back toward the shadows where she felt safe. The applause was still ringing in Chloe's ears, a loud and chaotic sound that felt completely foreign to her. She walked quickly away from the spotlight, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't look at the tables. She didn't look at Julian. She just wanted to get back to the safety of the kitchen, where the rules were simple and nobody expected her to be a genius. As she slipped through the swinging doors, the noise of the dining room faded into the background, replaced by the familiar clatter of pots and pans. It felt like stepping back into reality after waking up from a vivid dream. The kitchen staff, who had been watching through the porthole windows, burst into cheers of their own. Dave, the bartender, high-fived the dishwasher, and the head chef gave her a nod of genuine respect that he had never given before. Chloe. That was incredible. The manager shouted, rushing over to her. He looked like he had just won the lottery. I haven't seen them that quiet in years. Do you know Chopin List? Can you play more? He was already planning, his mind racing with ways to use her new talent to make more money for the restaurant. I can put you on a regular rotation. We can advertise musical nights. People will love it. Chloe leaned against the stainless steel counter, trying to catch her breath. Her hands were trembling slightly, the adrenaline starting to wear off and leave her feeling shaky. She looked at her manager, then down at her hands. They were still the same hands that had scrubbed dishes and carried trays all day. They were rough and tired. I can't play for the rest of the night, she said softly, her voice cutting through his excitement. I have a section to finish. Table 7 needs their water refilled, and Table 12 is waiting for their check. The manager stopped, looking confused. But Chloe, this is a huge opportunity. They love you. Why go back to serving when you can be up there? Because it's my job, she said simply. And I'm not done yet. She didn't know how to explain it to him. For those 5 minutes at the piano, she had been exposed. She had poured her soul out for a room full of strangers who had ignored her for hours. It was exhilarating, but it was also exhausting. She needed to ground herself again. She needed to be just Chloe for a little while longer. She washed her hands quickly in the sink, the cold water shocking her skin. She dried them, took a deep breath, and picked up a clean cloth and a water pitcher. She pushed the door open and stepped back into the dining room. The atmosphere had changed completely. The arrogant hum was gone. As she walked to table 7, people actually moved their chairs out of the way without being asked. They smiled at her, not the polite, dismissive smiles of before, but real smiles that reached their eyes. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and they were finally seeing the human being standing in front of them. She refilled the water glasses at table 7 with a steady hand. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked. The woman at the table, who had been complaining about the temperature earlier, looked up at her with awe. "No, thank you. You were amazing. I had no idea." Chloe gave a small, humble nod. "Thank you." She didn't say anything else. She didn't brag or explain her history. She just moved to the next table. When she reached the center of the room, she had to pass table 4. Julian was sitting there. The young colleague was packing up his briefcase, ready to leave, but Julian hadn't moved. He was sitting with his hands folded on the table, staring at the empty plate in front of him. He looked different. The confident, smug mask had slipped, and underneath, he just looked like a tired, middle-aged man. Chloe stopped at the side of the table to pick up their empty glasses. The air between them was thick with tension. The young colleague stood up quickly, looking awkward. Honestly, that was beautiful," he mumbled to Chloe, avoiding Julian's eyes. Chloe smiled at him. "Thanks." She turned to Julian. He slowly raised his head. Their eyes met for the first time since he had sneered at her. Chloe didn't look away. She didn't feel angry anymore. She didn't feel the need to prove herself. She saw the embarrassment in his face. She saw the realization that he had judged her wrongly. That was enough for her. She didn't need to rub it in. "Is there anything else I can get for you, sir?" she asked. Her tone was professional, calm, and polite. It was the exact same tone she had used earlier, but this time, it came from a place of strength, not submission. Julian opened his mouth, then closed it. He cleared his throat. He looked like he wanted to apologize, or maybe he wanted to compliment her, but the words seemed stuck. He had built a wall between them with his cruelty, and now he didn't know how to climb over it. Finally, he just shook his head slowly. "No," he said quietly. "Nothing. Thank you." Chloe nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, and gathered the glasses. As she turned and walked away, she felt a lightness in her step that hadn't been there when she started her shift. The weight of his judgment had evaporated. It turned out that his opinion didn't matter after all. He was just a man in a suit. She was a musician. She finished clearing the rest of her tables efficiently. The guests were kind to her, some even trying to tip her extra cash right into her hand, which she politely refused, telling them to add it to the bill. She was still on the clock. At the end of the night, the guests filed out. The corporate party was over. The mood of the departing crowd was thoughtful and hushed, the music still lingering in their minds. Chloe went back to the kitchen to clock out. The manager was there, counting the money. He looked at her with a mixture of frustration and admiration. "You really are full of surprises," he said. "Are you sure you won't play tomorrow? I'll pay you a bonus." Chloe untied her apron and hung it up on her hook. "I'm sure," she said. "I'm a waitress, remember, and I'm pretty good at it." She grabbed her bag and headed for the back exit. Stepping out into the cool night air was a relief. The city was quieter now, the streets lit by the orange glow of the street lamps. Chloe walked the familiar route home, her shoes clicking on the sidewalk. She wasn't floating, exactly, her feet still hurt from the long shift, but her spirit felt tall. She thought about the apartment waiting for her. It was still small, and the rent was still due. Nothing had changed on the outside. But everything had changed on the inside. She walked through the front door of her building and climbed the stairs. When she unlocked her apartment door, she was greeted by the silent, comforting shape of her upright piano in the corner. She didn't turn on the overhead light. She just walked over to the piano and sat down on the bench. The moonlight streamed through the window, casting a pale glow on the keys. She rested her fingers on them, just like she had done in the restaurant. But this time, she wasn't performing for anyone. She wasn't proving a point to a rude customer. She was just playing for herself. She played a simple melody, soft and sweet. It wasn't a showpiece, it was a lullaby for the long day she had just finished. And as the notes filled the small room, Chloe smiled. She knew who she was. She was the girl who carried trays, and the girl who made magic. And the world would just have to learn to see them both.